Larry, if you want to open the meeting, I will call the roll when you're ready.
Yes, okay. So here we go. We have two agenda items, as you'll see later today, after Scott calls the roll. So Scott, please call.
Great. Leandra Clark-Harvey.
Present.
Thank you. Maria Bonneville.
Present.
Mark Fisher-Colbury.
Here.
Fred Fisher. Judy Gasson.
Here.
Larry Goldstein.
Yep, here.
David Higgins.
Here.
Vito Imbasciani.
Here.
Steve Julesgaard.
Present.
Pat Levitt.
Present.
Lauren Miller-Rogan.
Here.
Marvin Southard.
Here.
Keith Yamamoto. Okay, Larry, we have a quorum. We're ready to go.
Okay, so let's take the first of the two agenda items, which will be the presentation and discussion of a revised neuropsychiatric concept plan. Rosa, if you'll take the screen and let us.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. Can you all see the main screen with the slide of the concept?
Yes.
And you can hear me. Fantastic.
Yes.
The Neuro Task Force, this is actually a complement. So we are going to present the revised concept based on the feedback that we have received from the last meeting from the Neuro Task Force. And this is actually a complement to the concept document that was distributed last Friday, and that contains the background and details complementary to this presentation. Throughout the presentation today, the intent is really to address the issues that were raised in the past meeting, and we will not be going over the same ground that we have already heard multiple times. Instead, the focus is going to be in the differences and the information responsive to the concept that's complementing the presentation. And here in this slide, you can see what the primary areas were that we identified that needed a revision. As a reminder, the REMIND initiative corresponds to the discovery phase of CERM's pillar programs, and the translational and the clinical will be addressed separately. CERM's neuroscience strategy has been developed, as we all know, in the context of our mission statement, and it maps out and integrates within our first theme of advanced world-class science. And the goal of the concept, the REMIND concept, is actually to accelerate the discovery of mechanisms underlying neuropsychiatric disorders, leading to the identification and validation of novel targets and biomarkers, with a goal to provide new avenues and rigorous foundations for future translational and clinical investigations. Obviously, our goal is to link really the discovery foundational work with the advancement of the development of therapies, which is why this is the goal. In order to do that, there are three objectives. The first one is to accelerate a foundational scientific understanding of neuropsychiatric disease mechanisms, as well as the development of relevant and transformative tools and technologies, which will at the same time help accelerate our understanding of these devastating diseases. The second objective is to catalyze multidisciplinary innovation, attracting new talent and ideas into neuropsychiatric research and seeding new partnerships. And the third objective is to drive open and collaborative science by leveraging CERN-funded and externally funded infrastructure for data, resources, and knowledge sharing. Some of the work of the Neuro Task Force over the past few months has been discussions around the ways in which we can achieve this goal and objectives. And one of the outcomes from the stakeholder discussions and from the Neuro Task Force discussions was that there was a need to develop a program with a structure that could allow for multidisciplinary large teams to work together. With more time and with larger amounts of funding, and the structure for this initiative program responds to those recommendations and prioritization elements, and includes these two funding opportunities that I'm going to go over that have distinct award structures and that will be offered through two independent requests for applications or RFAs. The first one is the REMIND-L. The L stands for Large Collaborative Projects. The REMIND-L RFA could support expansive cross-disciplinary studies led by large collaborative teams that could apply a range of technologies and approaches to their research proposed. This could be leading to novel biological insights, further current understanding of disease mechanisms, and expanding research to include the study of diverse human populations, as well as identifying and validating novel therapeutic hypotheses, targets, and or biomarkers. The other opportunity is REMIND-X. The X stands for exploratory. The REMIND-X RFA could support high-risk exploratory studies led by small multidisciplinary teams, and the proposed projects will be expected to lead to initial validation or proof of concept of novel models, tools, technologies, or hypotheses. Minimal preliminary data in this case would be required. Now, in terms of funding, the REMIND-L could be funding direct project cost of up to $2 million per project per year as a base component, and up to $8 million per award for up to 4 years in duration. And we would expect a maximum of 6 awards of these large collaborative projects. The REMIND-X could fund direct project cost of up to $1 million per award for up to 2 years duration. And it's just to be specific, is $500,000 per year, up to $1 million in total. Now, there is an option for the REMIND-L program, which could allow for additional funding of up to $500,000 per award per year that could be requested if an equivalent or larger amount of matching funds is provided and the research activities supported by this supplemental budget are described and well justified. The matching funds may be contributed by either California or non-California organizations, either for profit or non-profit. For the REMIND-X, some will fund the direct cost of up to $1 million, as I mentioned earlier on. Now, the total award budget for REMIND-L comes up to $88.2 million, taking into account the indirects and the facilities cost, and the REMIND-X could come up, assuming 12 awards, $22.5 million, also with the indirects and facilities. This next slide shows a timeline. If you can think essentially of 2024 as a year one for this program, in which we would launch the first set of REMIND-L awards, and then the REMIND-X could launch a year later in 2025. Now, in terms of eligibility, the changes from the presentation last time include that we have lowered the minimum percent effort for the investigators. You can see for the PI in the REMIND-L, we have a 15% minimum effort, and for co-investigators, that there will be 4 or more, a 10% in the REMIND-L. Again, these are very large awards. And for the REMIND-X, we have principal investigator 5% and co-investigators also a minimum of 5%. And there was in the appendix a comparator table that shows a similar type of awards from other organizations and what are the requirements, so you can have a reference there. The second change that we made to the presentation here is that we clarified the roles of the investigators. So there is a PI in both of them and the rest are co-investigators. And then the third one is that we removed favorable consideration for applications that include early career faculty, as per your feedback. This is the project eligibility. The main change, there are 2 changes that we made here. In the first point is that we aligned the language with the concept document, and we changed from including studies using stem cells genetic research to actually employing stem cell genetic research as part of the central approach. What this means is that if you have, say, 5 different projects making the large collaborative Remind L project, there could be a way that one of the projects might not have a stem cell genetic research component, but that it will help validate the rest of the approaches that they will all have a stem cell and genetic research. That's what we meant by this point. And that were all the changes that we made in terms of project eligibility. In terms of the data sharing and DEI, data sharing and knowledge produced from CERN-funded projects is key, as we know, to advancing the field of regenerative medicine and accelerating the treatments for patients. And since the passing of our Prop 14, CERN has implemented a set of guidelines to share and manage data, all with a vision to enable a collaborative ecosystem infrastructure that Remind will be part of. And as such, we will be requiring data sharing and management plans based on the data sharing and management plan guidelines, as well as we will coordinate with other CERN data initiatives that might be coming up in the future, always subject to the board's approval. And in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Remind program will also uphold to the principles of DEI, and applicants will be required to include plans to address consistent with all the programs within CERN's offerings. This is the overall vision of how this program will lead to accelerate world-class science, to further accelerate the discovery of novel insights into mechanisms of neuropsychiatric diseases. The Remind program will aim to establish a collaborative network of multidisciplinary research through new funding structures, which are the large teams, as we were talking, Remind L and the Remind X earlier projects, but also complementary to our current D0 and these two CERN-DIS pillar projects. And furthermore, leveraging with CERN-funded infrastructure elements like the shared resource labs that we are right now having applications for and others, and external consortia networks and data platforms that we are currently under discussions with, always dependent on how this concept moves forward. This is just to show that ecosystem type of infrastructure will ultimately drive the objectives of that we mentioned earlier on, and connecting our three pillars of research and development, leading to increasing the efficiency and success of clinical trials if we are successful. And this is a summary of the updated program budget, reflecting the changes that were made based upon your feedback. And as a reminder, in June, the agency's research budget had a placeholder of $62.2 million for the Remind concept plan, the Remind L concept plan, a number that was understood to be subject to revision as the concept plan was further refined. With the benefit of the work of this task force, the actual program budget is now clear and will require $26 million more for Remind L for the fiscal year 23-24 budget. This additional allocation will be sought of the full board at the September ICOC consideration of this concept plan, assuming, of course, that the task force recommends bringing the concept plan to that meeting. And the Remind X budget request could be made the year after as part of the fiscal year 24-25 research budget. And in terms of the final slide is the action that we request could be to have the board approve the proposed Remind program concept. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this concept and to gather the feedback and implement it into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. That was terrific. And those are excellent changes in response to suggestions from the last meeting. So questions for Rosa? Judy.
Hi, thank you, Larry. Great job, Rosa. Some of my colleagues looked at the concept plan that you sent out and had a couple questions. There's a footnote right in the beginning that describes the topic of neuroscience. And if you go all the way to the end of the document, and I apologize, I don't have it open, it's a very broad definition of neuro. It's not specific to neuropsych. And I just wondered what the purpose of that footnote was.
Thank you for the question, Judy. This definition came upon feedback from one of the board members that requested to clarify. If we think about Prop 14, the way that it was defined, diseases of the brain and the CNS, in some ways, is not really telling us which brain diseases we are tackling. And the footnote, I think, was the intention was to clarify what kind of diseases the overall Prop 14 could be tackling, eventually. What is it that we are interested in working our research towards?
So it's really the broad
definition. It was a broad definition of what neuro, I mean, if we think about it, neuro is CNS as well as ENS and PNS, the peripheral nervous system as well. So it's not just the CNS that we could be tackling, and that's what this had the intention of.
Okay, another colleague noted that you talked about behavioral phenotyping as one of the areas of interest. Could you just say a word, Rosa, about what you're categorizing as behavioral phenotyping?
Well, that was initially behavioral phenotyping in terms of neuropsychiatric disorders. We know that there are studies that we have considered mental health disorders in the context of the current diagnostic categories, but there are also the neurobehavioral domains, the RDoC, that it's something that we are interested also in taking into account. So that's what we were conveying by this.
Great, thank you. And then just one final point. One of my colleagues brought up what would happen at the end of the 4 years. And I know we've talked about possibly transitioning to the existing translation or clinical programs, but the colleague asked if we could at least consider that more fully, whether that would be the right transition or whether there should be some sort of other process at the end of this, just for future consideration. So thank you again, Rosa. Great presentation and great concept document.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Pat.
Ooh, I'm muted. Yeah, thanks very much, Rosa. It was great. Just a few questions. One is there's been some modest language changes that, as I read it, might attract research using animal models. Because there's manipulation of DNA and nucleic acids, and there's something in what you described where they would have to justify that. And and while I do that kind of research, I'm worried that that there would be a large cadre of applications coming in from individuals like myself who are doing animal model work. Right, which I think is, from what we heard from the presentations, not necessarily the most rapid path forward. And in particular, the work that CIRM supports. Certainly, the work we heard from Rusty Gage, where he's doing xenografts, where he's using human stem cells into animal models, would certainly be fully appropriate because there's the use of human stem cells. But I just put that on the table. I am a little worried that we're going to get like a bunch of applications for, mouse models or rodent models of disease, which the NIH is fully inundated with. I don't know if you want to comment about that.
I think what we would hope to do is obviously there are studies about neural circuits and connectivity that we will need those models. But what we hope is that there will be complementary approaches. And by the way that we provide instructions through our review criteria and our RFA, it will be clear that the approaches need to be complementary and validate each other, and there will have to be a minimum of there will have to be stem cell and gene and genetic research approaches that will be substantial and that will utilize human models. But obviously, we might need the animal models as well, and it will all be a question of the balance and the review criteria when we develop them for the reviewers.
So in the team's vision of this, in terms of the RFA, because the RFA will really define the kinds of applications that are going to come in. There's going to be a minimum requirement for use of human stem cells, if I understand what you said, or just stem cells in general, because of course all vertebrate and invertebrate species have stem cells, right? So I
yes,
mean, you could imagine applications coming in. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just pointing out what the possibilities are, and that we're really trying to attract. There are models, great biological and neuroscience models using Drosophila and C. elegans that do stem cell work.
Yeah. So we will ask that. Sorry for interrupting, Pat. I was going to clarify, because this is in the concept. We are going to ask that any use of non-human models need to be justified and need to include research to validate any discoveries made in those non-human model systems with comparable studies using relevant tissues and models based in humans. So that's part of the concept, and it's going to be the same eligibility of the project translated into the RFA. And then in terms of the studies that employ stem cells and genetic research, what we are asking is that researchers, as part of their overall approach, include the studies that employ stem cells and genetic research as part of the central approach or a hypothesis that they will be tested in these multidisciplinary teams. And then we allow that, because we are asking for multidisciplinary, we are asking applicants to provide a justification if there are studies that do not directly involve these stem cells or genetic research, but how those genetic, non-genetic research and stem cells will be actually providing utility and or validity to stem cell and genetic component of the study in the study of neuropsychiatric diseases. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. This is a very important question, so thank you for asking.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the RFA is written in a way where we really promote the generate excitement in the field about really getting, rolling our sleeves up and getting to the disease models that all our experts who came to talk to us say are the most likely approaches that are going to yield benefits. The other thing that that is based on what one of the questions that Judy posed, or one of the comments from someone who read the initial one, that instead of saying behavioral phenotyping, which then, I read that as well. I said, oh, so we're going to be doing, the behavioral phenotyping in mouse models again, right? But you could change the word behavioral to functional phenotyping, which means that you could be doing anything from beautiful cell biology to electrophysiology on organoids and other things. And that's functional phenotyping, and would avoid sort of this construct where people read that and say, oh, so behavioral phenotyping of disease models is something that CERM wants to see, which I think is probably not necessarily the case. I don't know if others agree with that, but I think changing from behavioral to functional might be helpful.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Pat. Yeah.
Okay.
Now I see where Julie was coming from.
That's it.
Thank you.
Fred.
You're muted, Fred.
Yeah, thank you. If there are other hands up pertaining to the concept plan, you should take those questions first, and I'll just wait till the end with this. Otherwise, I will play my broken record.
I don't see any.
So let me just add to Pat's concern. I wonder if we could just tighten up the language a little bit to promote a focus on humans primarily in the applications.
Okay, so do you have any suggestions besides the? let me see,
I
I'm
would
trying
have to go back through the language of the concept
Yeah.
plan, and I'll do that and send them to you.
Okay, yes, we can do that. What we say right now is we ask that the applicant must justify any proposed use of non-human models and include research to validate any discoveries made in non-human model systems with comparable studies using relevant tissues or models based in human cells. STEM permits vital studies that are only feasible using non-human models. However, applicants may be asked to provide additional scientific justification in just cases. Happy to revise offline.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Anybody else before we go to Fred? Fred, you're on.
So I guess I'll ask the staff this question. Rosa, you may be the best. Of the proposals that we intend to get from this concept plan, which are currently disqualified from funding through any of CIRM's existing funding pathways?
They are basically, we are not funding this type of research
No,
at the
That's
scale
not
that.
that's not what I asked. I asked, we're not talking about the scale, because funding at a different scale means marketing to the scientific community the opportunity to submit proposals focused on any one of a million specific areas. And given that we have been entirely preoccupied by neuropsych for every single one of our meetings, I want to know which of the proposals that are being imagined, because now, we found ourselves going down a scientific rabbit hole about whether we're going to fund animal models or not. And I really don't see any of that as the purview of this committee, but it's certainly invited because of the nature of what the discussion has been. And I keep coming back to, it's the same question I asked of the person connected to the letters that the comments we were receiving about the work of this work group. And I asked, isn't that something that can be considered through one of CIRM's existing funding pathways? And the answer I got, I think, was a yes, or a qualified yes. But and so
No,
I'm going to keep, I want to keep coming back to understanding what is it about neuropsych that is so unique that it cannot be funded through one of CIRM's existing funding pathways. I'm not talking about the volume of proposals. We've already determined neuropsych is underrepresented in the things CIRM fund. That's a different question than, could CIRM be funding those things if people applied? And is a concept plan the way to get people to apply who otherwise would not? Regardless of the budget, because going back to our what I understand our charge to be in the legislation and from the board maybe, is we're supposed to evaluate the extent to which we're going to meet or exceed what the proposition mandates. So here we are, involved in granular conversations about the kind of science that could or should be funded. It just has me wondering, couldn't or shouldn't all of this science be funding through one of CERM's existing pathways? Or tell me there is no pathway for neuropsych. I believe that there is. I believe the problem with neuropsych is it has not been funded for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with having a concept plan. Tell me I'm wrong.
So Fred, this is Pat. So what do you see as the paths, given what we heard from, I think we would all agree are national experts in this area using a variety of different approaches. What would you say are the paths that currently exist to address the challenges that were raised by the presenters, not by this committee, but by the presenters, about why research focused on neuropsychiatric disorders has challenges, current state challenges that could be resolved by the current funding schemes that CERM has?
Clin, discovery, I mean, all of those.
Well, we heard that.
If there's a problem with those,
yeah,
then we should fix that problem. We shouldn't go create a whole new thing and spend so much time in this committee focused on neuropsych when we can make some small tweaks or recommend some small tweaks to other existing funding pathways that solve whatever the problem is.
So Clin and translation, right? Two of those from the experts basically said that neuropsych's not ready, and that the focus really needs to be on discovery of mechanisms because it lags far behind other brain and peripheral nervous system disorders. That was a pretty consistent message from everyone who presented. So it's almost all in the realm of discovery now, right?
Okay.
And so we have a DISC program, and while I understand the point that you're trying to make, scale matters a lot depending upon the kind of research. It can't be ignored. Scale matters a lot depending upon the level of complexity of the research that has to be done in order to make the breakthrough discoveries. So I would argue that the scale matters, and if you're suggesting that we just change the scale of the current DISC components, I'm not savvy enough to know how that would work in terms of what CERM is.
By scale, do you mean the number of proposals funded, or do you mean the amount of funding? Like, I don't know, maybe I don't understand what you mean.
So the reason why, for example, NIMH came up with the Conti Center approach is that individual R01 grants were insufficient to address major challenges of understanding mechanisms of disorders and other goals that they had at NIMH. So they came up with something called the Conti Centers, which was an interdisciplinary approach, can't be done in a single grant, and scaled it in terms of how much resources were available in order to make it viable to actually do the studies. So they came up with a different approach. They already had R01 mechanisms in place, and they came up with a new approach to try to attract and to try to build a larger effort in what they viewed as a major gap in knowledge. That was their approach. And I think this is a pretty similar, from my perspective, a pretty similar approach, because I personally participated in multiple Conti centers, as well as having R01s, and they are different in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. I don't know if others want to comment on it, but that's how
so in my lay mind, because I am not a scientist, I'm not familiar with anything that you're talking about. So my simple mind is, what has to change about DISC in order to accommodate neuropsych funding applications?
A lot.
Well, like what?
Change.
Well,
so right now we have, Mark wants to say something. Mark.
Fred, as you said, this is a rerun. We've had this discussion before.
Yeah.
And the answer before was the neuropsych mental health disorders currently has zero funding. We went on this path to find out how we fix the zero funding. And this plan that we've come up with was the plan that came to be developed so that we can do for mental health diseases what is done in others. That's really what this is all about. And as you said, we've had this discussion before, and that's why the staff has done, to my mind, this wonderful job of putting together a plan that can open doors that have been previously closed.
Great.
And if you
Thank you.
don't mind me adding something, is that there are two distinct questions here. The disease area of neuropsych can be supported by this, TRAN, and or CLEAN, as you very well said, Fred. However, the REMIND program is structurally very different from this, and is the only multi-investigator opportunity for research at CERN. And we are proposing a new mechanism here with neuropsych as the starting point, but we could eventually expand from there. And that's what we started in January. It was a new proposal for a new way to think about how to fund discovery research in neuro. And we've said it with the advancing the disease mechanism research, accelerating disease mechanism research, catalyzing multidisciplinary, multi-investigator, and driving collaboration. And those are very distinct from what we have right now. Larry.
And did the neuropsych community say, this is what we want? We want multi-site collaborative projects that will help us fix our problem. And we want small investigator grants, and that will help fix our problem. Like, is this solution what we have heard from those we are expecting to get proposals from but have not?
Yes, the answer
Great.
to that is yes.
Okay.
And we
So-
have also consulted with the National Institutes of Mental Health program directors and directors of division about the things that we could do to complement and what they are being asked. And those are the themes that we've been hearing.
Great. So now I have a bigger picture question.
Well, hang on a second, Fred. I'd like to just add to this part of the conversation. That's why.
Okay, go ahead.
And I think the other thing I'd like to add is that part of the point for that series of speakers that we had was to actually tell us that the field is ready for this kind of interdisciplinary project to make some headway. By and large, if you had asked, say, a year or two ago, it's not obvious to me that the field would have been quite as ready. But there have been breakthroughs in technology, and there have been breakthroughs in insights that make an approach like this actually feasible, whereas before I think it would not have been.
Great. My bigger picture question is wondering what happens when we, this group, stop talking about neuropsych? What is our process going to be going forward? Are we going to
Fred,
pick?
that's the rest of the meeting after we finish this part.
Okay. Then I guess I'll be interested, because if this is the pattern, we pick a disease area or we pick an indication, we spend weeks on it, and then we create a concept plan for that. And then we do another one and we create a concept plan for that. This was not at all what I signed up for, which is why I keep having so much trouble with it. And maybe I shouldn't be here. I mean, I've got things to say about neuro, but this process is not helping us answer the question, are we going to meet the requirements of the in terms of the spending requirements of the proposition? This particular concept plan and all of the time we have spent in advance of it, hopefully will generate requests for funding in neuropsych. I just am curious to know if this is the model that this group is going to be using going forward, because it will be arduous and take a very long time. But I guess I'll wait to see what that looks like later in the meeting.
Thank you. Leandra.
Hey everyone, just to want to share a few comments. First of all, thank you. Thank you to the staff. I really appreciate at the last meeting you sharing with us the concepts. And I'm remain very excited about all of it. I also think that, kind of Fred's comment around like, what happens when we stop talking about it or focusing on it. My personal opinion is that right now, the zeitgeist, the political climate is very much focused on kind of behavioral health, right? So it's the perfect opportunity to be doing this. I think it's timely, and we need to take advantage of every kind of political win that we can get right now and support when we have a governor that's committed to behavioral health in place, and so many things that are happening in this realm. So I think it's now is the right time. I'm excited that we have this group, that it was carved out. I'm excited that there's work happening here and to be a part of the group. And I also want to thank Fred for keeping us honest and really checking in around the process and what makes sense as we go forward. I think for my personal opinion and professional opinion is that right now, this is a great way to attack it and to strategize and to work with like minds. And I also think Fred's thinking ahead. Okay, so what happens when the next thing pops up, and how do we organize this as a certain kind of family to address issues? And I encourage and support more thought there around, is there a better process to be doing that? Is this the best way? Not saying that this isn't, but I think that we have to keep considering that as well. So really grateful. I think this is a wonderful process and method for doing it. And I'm open to also what might be better. So encouraging staff and the team to continue to look at that and to take that in. So.
Thank you, Leandra. Before I call for a motion, I just want to add one bit of numerology that we've done in the past, which is when we've computed the percentage of awarded grants historically, in fact, we are in general on path to meet the 1.5 billion commitment. So it's not obvious to me that there's a likely problem there, but we will return to this topic shortly. Any further questions for Rosa? Then can I call for a motion to recommend sending this concept plan on to the science subcommittee, which will be the next step?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion from this group? Scott, do we have public comment?
I will check, and I will ask if Doug and Lana can check. In the meantime, just for clarity, Larry, if perhaps we could have the motion and second restated to recommend that the science subcommittee consider the concept plan and that the budget be augmented in the amount that was described by Rose, I believe, 26 million. So just those two recommendations.
Yes, thank you for the revision. Do the motion or the second have any objection to that?
No.
Fred, you have a question. You're muted, Fred.
Sorry. If we're in the discussion phase following the first and the second, then I guess I would ask why we need a budget augmentation at all, given that we are so early in the fiscal year. Is it because this will presumably drain resources already accounted for through other CERM programs?
I'm happy to provide the answer. Thank you, Fred. So as I was mentioning in the program budget summary slide, when we proposed the June research budget, the $62.2 million that we had allocated for the Remind L, which is what we will do this year, were actually a placeholder, and it was understood at that time that it would be subject to revision as the concept plan was further refined. And given all the input and variations that we've received, now the budget is clear and the program structure is clear, and it will require 26 million more for the Remind L. So we are going from an initial allocation of $62.2 million for Remind L to an 88.2 million now that we have it all squared down.
Thank you, Rosa. Scott, no public comment?
If there's anyone on the telephone with public comment, I believe you're supposed to press the 9 number now.
Star 9. No public comment.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any, Larry. I think we can proceed to the vote.
Yes, please call the roll. Oh, whoops, there's a hand.
There's a hand.
Sorry, 3536. Please go ahead and speak up.
And you have 3 minutes.
You are either muted or we cannot hear you. Seven 146513536 with your hand up. Do you have something to add, please?
Yes, you must forgive me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, my name is John Ridelli. I might be a little too early. I probably need to wait till later on in the program. I was going to speak to the Neuro Task Force in behalf of Athersys. Should I wait a little later?
On behalf of Athersys, is that a company?
Yes, Athersys. They're working on, they're in a phase 3 pivotal trial for ischemic stroke. I guess the question is, will you be asking for comments after you finish the next segment of your meeting?
Yes, we will be. That's
Okay,
correct.
well then maybe I should wait because I'm a little premature.
Okay, thank you very much for your consideration. Any other public comment? Hearing none, can we move on to a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Leandra Clark Harvey,
Yes.
Maria Bonneville,
Yes.
Mark Fisher Colbury.
Aye.
Thank you. Fred Fisher,
Yes,
Judy Gasson,
Yes.
Larry Goldstein,
Yes.
David Higgins,
Yes.
Vito Imbasciani,
Yes.
Steve Julesgaard,
Yes.
Pat Levitt,
Yes.
Lauren Miller Rogan,
Yes.
and Marvin Southard.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. And the motion carries.
Good. Thank you very much, members of the task force. So let's move on to the second part of this meeting, which is to talk a little bit about what the roadmap should look like moving forward. I sent questions around as part of the agenda. You've all had a chance to look at them. One thing I want to do before we get into any more of the weeds, so to speak, about what sorts of questions we want to ask moving forward. Pat Levitt made a very good simplifying suggestion. And if I could have the last slide up, please, Scott, or whoever is controlling the screen. Scott, is that not you?
Let me see. Give me 2 seconds and I will share my screen, but let me pull it up.
Thank you. In brief, what Pat pointed out in an email he sent me prior to this meeting is that we dealt with neuropsychiatric as a whole in thinking about it. So depression, mania, bipolar, variety of different substance abuse, a variety of different disorders were clumped together as a whole in neuropsychiatric as a category of disease. Pat suggested that in moving forward and thinking about what do our current, here we go. down to the last one where it says possible clustering of diseases. Thank you. Pat suggested that if we tried to move forward and review our commitments and the quality of our commitments or discovery of unfunded areas, if we did so disease by disease, it would first of all be completely dissimilar to the way we dealt with neuropsychiatric as shown here. And second of all, there are, in a sense, so many different diseases, we would get bogged down pretty quickly trying to make it through disease by disease. And so Pat suggested, and I think this is a good idea, we'll see what the rest of the task force thinks, that we deal with neurodegenerative, for example, as a class of disease that includes, some of the disorders shown here, Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's, et cetera, and that we have an additional class, which is neuroinjury, which would include stroke, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, et cetera. You all can read. I think that's just a generally very good suggestion for organizing how we proceed. We can always look at the individual disease level if that turns out to be important for some reason. But this is something that the task force needs to discuss and either accept or not. So comments and questions about this mode of proceeding. Leandra.
Sorry, I had all the emojis at once. They're flying all over. I'm not waving. I'm actually, that was my hand up. And, forgive me if I missed that. Can you talk a little bit more around the rationale for doing this, just a little bit deeper about that? I think for me, I'm always thinking about unintended consequences. And so while something may seem practical, I think considering a lot of the stigma and kind of lack of focus traditionally in these areas, what I don't want to do is end up with neuropsychiatric, for example, getting less attention, or there not being parity across these subcategories. So there might be a really good reason to do this. I'm just trying to look to understand it a bit better. So thank you for your patience. But could you, can you explain just a little bit more around why we need to do this and how it would really benefit the process here?
Sure. So I'll give you my take on it. And is this something you want to comment on, Steve, or is it a different topic?
I want to comment on this topic when you're done, Larry, sorry.
On this one, is that right?
Yes, exactly. On your proposal, I have a comment.
Sure,
a different.
Yeah. A different. So let me address at least my view of an answer to Leandra, which is first, neuropsychiatric, in a sense, set a model for how we can perhaps efficiently think about different areas of neurodisease research. Neuropsychiatric as a category, neurodegenerative as a category, neural injury as a category. I think second, Pat's point, and I agree with this, is that if in the review process, we try to go completely disease by disease rather than category, it will bog down because there are so many individual disorders. Some of them very rare, but that nonetheless would demand attention. It's not an irreversible commitment to do it this way, would be my final point about this, that if, as we start to analyze our commitments and expected future commitments about neurodegenerative disorders or neuroinjury disorders, for example, we might find that, in some set of cases, we do need to delve more deeply into an individual disease. And in fact, our speakers in neuropsychiatric did, for the most part, talk about individual diseases they were working on, which illustrated what was possible in the neuropsychiatric area in general. And I'd argue that something similar is likely to pertain as we analyze and review our commitments in neurodegenerative and neuroinjury. So that's my take. Steve.
Thanks. Oh, before you move on, first of all, thank you for the explanation. And if this is just for tracking purposes and data and outcomes, then I think that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I would add, since I sent the email. It's really a structural, organizational way of thinking about it, because I think it's very difficult, or at least I find it very difficult, to what would amount to having a task switch, right? Like if we started with schizophrenia and then we went to epilepsy, and then we went to Huntington's. It's, you know, the communities that are doing important research in these areas are different. They share a lot of overlap in approaches, and it's an organizational way of thinking, so that and it also provides, I think, members of the Neuro Task Force to then make recommendations about areas in which they feel they know experts who would benefit from, where we would benefit from them presenting. And if you group in this way, you can have several in a row that are going to touch upon sort of fundamental mechanisms of, you know, degenerative processes, right? Or injury induced processes. So that was the rationale behind it. I wasn't thinking anything about how to organize or even think about how to organize funding. That's a different conversation. So it's really, Andrew, as you said, it's very organizational and restricts having to task switch over and over again.
Thank you, Pat. Steve.
Yes, so I have two observations. The first is the reason that we agreed to an area like neuropsychiatry is that as was demonstrated in all the presentations that were made leading up to today's decision, we had absolutely no funding with regard to this area in general, putting aside any of the individual conditions, right? And we tried to understand why that was true. And then we tried to come up with a solution to, you know, to alleviate that issue of failure to be able to fund things. And so hopefully we found that. So I think that's fine. I think we did what we ought to have done to get this area up and started. We'll see how well it works out. The other two areas now are lists of specific diseases, many of which we already have funding available for. We have provided funding for individual conditions. So they're a quantum different than the neuropsychiatric area in the sense that there are identified areas for funding. But I think all of this begs a predicate question, and that is, and this is what I think the predicate question is. We have two directions we can go. One is the one you referred to obliquely, Larry, earlier on, which is that we already have a fair amount of funding in the neuro area, and we're on a path or a pace to potentially use the 1.5 million out of the total it's either 5 or 5.5 million total funding. So that path basically says we're done picking a particular area or a particular neuro disease or condition. We're going to just, we're going to accept all applications as we always have that have to do with neurological issues. And we're going to let the best ones that meet scientific muster, we're going to let those proceed and not others that don't meet the requisite scientific, approach or scientific merit. I'm sorry, that's what I'm looking for. That's one approach. That's one we have been using historically. And in theory, we will use up the rest of the 4 million, or rest of the 1.4 million or so of our funds doing that. The other is the one that we're kind of embarked on right now, which is do we actually want to pick and choose? Do we want to pick and choose disease conditions based on how they occurred, neurodegeneration versus injury, for example? And even within one of those, do we want to pick and choose? For example, do we want to pick and choose stroke? next, because it's a major issue for an aging population if you use the DALI, which, of course, is in and of itself is controversial. So I think we ought to have a discussion about whether we want to go one way or the other before we get into, if we're going to go the way of really picking and choosing one, neurodegeneration versus nerve injury or some other division, or even into individual diseases. Let's decide that's what we want to do, as opposed to let's just do it the way we've always done it and let the the best applications prevail, whatever neurological area they're in. End of that's it.
Good. Thank you. Good thoughts. I think we'll come back to this when we go to the next part that I was hoping we would take on, Steve. So stay tuned.
Sure.
Maria B.
I also wonder what outcome we want. So it's difficult enough to sort of narrow down how we're going to approach it, and also what outcome we want from this. And I think Fred actually mentioned this at one of the first meetings. It's 1.5 billion sounds like a ton of money, but if what you're trying to do is cure or find a cure for a disease, that's not a lot of money. So I guess I would love to establish what our outcomes are, what we hope to get out of the focused areas.
Sorry. So, okay. Fred?
Sorry, it takes me longer than I'd like to drive this iPad. Would it be too much to refresh our recollection about the charge of this committee? Because what I heard today is one of our charges, I think, is we will meet or exceed the funding requirement in Neuro. It's then helpful to look at what the other charges of this committee is so that we can compare what it is we're trying to do with what we've actually been charged to do. Look, somebody is bringing it up somewhere. That's awesome. Thank you. Someone else will have to read it because it's way too small for me.
Okay, so why don't I go ahead and try to read this? It's also a little small for me. The goal of the CERM Task Force on Neuroscience and Medicine is to generate a general plan for the 1.5 billion set aside for neuroscience and related medicine, as specified in Proposition 14, in addition to generating a general plan for neuroscience and related medicine. The task force aims to identify unusual opportunities for high impact in these areas for enhanced investment. The task force will work with the community in California and beyond to identify potentially high impact opportunities in basic neuroscience, neurodegenerative disease, neuropsychiatric disease, neurodevelopment, and normal brain aging. The goal of the task force is to provide final recommendations to CERM and the ICOC within 6 months of inception. I think we've missed that goal, but we're moving along. So that's the original charge. I'll point out that it covers what we've done with neuropsychiatric, as it was an unusual opportunity that was identified that we should put some additional investment into because we felt we were underinvested. Moving forward, we can have a look at the different general areas, it seems to me, and ask, are there unusual high impact approaches or areas within neurodegenerative or neuroinjury or what have you, to see if there are potentially high impact opportunities that we've been missing that might profit from a different mechanism of funding, the way Rosa and her team have developed Remind L and X, or whether something else might be appropriate. Similarly, as we'll see in a couple slides moving forward, some of the questions I think we do need to think about is, what fraction of the 1.5 billion do we want to specifically program as opposed to what comes in over the transom for the grants working group to evaluate for merit and technical sophistication and feasibility.
So the way my tired brain works, I apologize to all of you for having to suffer through it. I'm trying to, and it's really back to Maria's question, I'm trying to tease out of that charge what the actual deliverables are, because I heard general plan connected to two different sort of things. One, a general plan for neuro investment, which is like the big picture macro, how CIRM is investing in neuro. And we have to come up with a general plan for CIRM's neuro investment. And then there was another general plan that wasn't that. I can't remember what it is, and we've moved off it, but someone here must know it. So it'd be helpful to really break down these deliverables, tease them out of the lot of words that are there, to understand exactly what the deliverable is, how many deliverables we actually have, because what that part of what that charge says to me is our responsibility is not just the 1.5 billion, that we have a responsibility for a general plan for CIRM's investment in neuro, which could go well beyond that. I think, as I don't know what's on your next slide, but I think at some point, and if someone could send me the link to that page or just send me the page, I would tease out those words into specific deliverables so that what we can do as we contemplate going forward, we can evaluate what we're doing and which of the deliverables it will help us meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Scott, can you go to the previous slide? I'm hoping that this is going to help the conversation.
Does that help? Can you see that?
It has seemed to me in thinking about this, thank you for enlarging that the sorts of questions we're going to need to deal with are here. This is not all of the questions we might want to address, but it strikes me these are some of the important ones. So for example, what percentage of the 1.5 billion that's set aside does this task force think we should be making recommendations for? And a corollary of that is question 2, what percentage of the 1.5 billion plus should be allocated based on quality and novelty of ideas and approach as assessed by the grants working group, taking what comes in over the transom as opposed to centralized planning. And I'll point out that what we have done thus far was to identify neuropsychiatric as an area that was being missed for any of a variety of reasons. We probably should not continue that particular discussion at the moment. But we need to think about, what fraction do we tackle as an unusual opportunity or a missed area? And that's what's there in question 4. Are there any important areas that we're missing in neurodegenerative, in neuroinjury, or perhaps there's another category that just didn't occur to me that we need to think about and ask whether we've got an appropriate investment. And I'll just add point 3 here, because Fred pointed out a few meetings ago that, DALI estimates impact in a particular way. Some people favor it, some don't. There are other potential measures of impact that could be used that might inform our thinking. Pat and I have been talking about who we might identify that's a healthcare economist who could tell us a little more in a presentation to us. What other measures of disease impact might inform our thinking in identifying either targets of opportunity or underfunded areas that we're just not meeting the bill on? So, my hope is these questions help us in thinking about where we need to go moving forward.
Just from a linguistic point of view, because words matter, is the 1.5 billion truly a set aside, or is it a benchmark that we are expected to meet or exceed in terms of CIRM's total funding strategy? I think how we refer to it, how we sort of think about it, obviously a lot of what CIRM does falls in the neuro space, and so just trying to understand if it's really a set aside or we have deliverables in terms of plans for how CIRM invests it in ways that meet or exceed 1.5 billion, which we've already said we will. So,
Steve, do you have an answer to that question for us? Steve? While Steve finds his unmute button, I think it's the latter, Fred, was my reading of the prop. It wasn't so much an exact set aside, a tranche of money that wouldn't be touched temporarily or, just had to be spent on its own. It really is a goal, a statutory goal. We have to do it. But it's not necessarily handled as a second bank account. Steve, you're on.
Yeah, I'll beg to differ just a bit on that, Larry.
That's fine.
From the language of Prop 14, the Institute shall allocate at least $1.5 billion. The keyword allocate shall allocate at least $1.5 million of the proceeds of the bonds to make grants for research, therapy, development, and therapy delivery involving diseases of the brain and central nervous system. And then it goes on to list a number of conditions. So the word is allocate. It shall allocate at least $1.5 billion. So that tells me that it's set aside for that particular use. Then that $1.5 billion is not to be used for anything else other than, and I'll ask Scott, since he's the administrative officer here, what his views are, but that's my reading of the language.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. It takes me a few minutes to find it in the new proposition, but I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, it's on page, I don't know, I have mine, it's on page 103. Let's see. It's
Yeah, Health and Safety Code 125290.70.5.
Right.
Subdivision C, it looks like.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Steve, do you think that the way I look at it and the way you look at it necessarily tells us to proceed in a different manner?
No, I'm just saying this was the issue that I raised some time ago. So if we're on a course that we spend $1.5 billion on diseases of the central nervous system and brain or conditions at the same pace as the rest of the organization is using money for other areas besides the nervous system, then we're all fine. But if let's imagine that we're spending money at a faster rate for everything else but the nervous system, and at the end of the day, we spent the $4 billion of other money for all the other things that are going on, gene therapy issues, et cetera, et cetera. And we still have $500 million that hasn't been spent on CNS diseases, then we're going to have absent a re-upping of funding, which I always assume it isn't going to happen and then be pleasantly surprised when it does. We're going to wind up having a CERM that's dedicated to the CNS area as far as finding additional funding goes. So that's kind of how I've looked at it. Is it's, you know, if we're on a pace to spend as much money on the CNS as we are on everything else, then that shouldn't be an issue. It's just we're going to have to see as time goes on how that works.
Yeah, my recollection is that we're spot on, Steve, but I did not bring the numbers today, or I don't have them prepared. I promise to do that at the next task force meeting.
No, I think we are pretty close as of today. It's the question of, you know, what will happen down the road. But anyway,
well, that's a bit what the planning discussion may need to revolve around in part. Is, you know, what guideposts do we need to be sure to install for the next several years to make sure we stay on track? And to what extent do we want to do that via the centralized planning method versus the taking what comes in over the transom, as opposed to, or some combination of the two? I mean, these are questions all funding organizations face in my experience. How much centralized planning do you do, such as what we did in neuropsychiatric, where we're hoping to get a little kickstart of that field, versus what we have been doing, which is more or less keeping us on track in a relatively passive way, you know, taking the best that comes in for the different sorts of RFAs we have in place, and trusting that we will continue at the same rate, but we need to keep an eye on it.
So just as an aside, Scott, have you had a chance to find that provision and look at it, and what's your assessment of the language?
Yes, I have, and I agree with you. I mean, it's a strict allocation. So whether you call it a set aside or by another name, it's sort of walled off from any purpose other than the purposes that are delineated in the statute.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other
But
thoughts?
I guess what does it
Ben.
mean for us if we think we are on pace to do 1.5 billion in neuro? What does it mean for the purpose of this? How does that inform what this group does next? Because we've already accomplished or believe we have accomplished that goal, and we could probably, in terms of a general plan, map out some estimates about what we think we're going to spend in the neuro area, and either try to do that, you know, as a whole, or more granularly in ways that include, you know, call out neuropsych. But if we think we will meet the spending objectives of the proposition, there are some other deliverables, it seems to me, that we ought to be focused on, and that in the passive way you described, I think we'll end up meeting the financial goals. So it's sort of the other goals in our charge that we have to be focused on. Is that an unfair interpretation?
I think that's entirely reasonable, Fred. You know, it seems like what we might do, as opposed to, you know, worrying about the rate of spending, is think about, do we have the balance right among some of these broad areas? And as in the case of neuropsychiatric, is there someplace that we're missing the boat, where there's been a technological breakthrough, a better understanding of the genetics of some of the disorders, which is what's happened in neuropsychiatric, or other things happening in the fields that lead us to either try to identify a specific need that we find, or that we think the balance internally in neuro is not quite where we want it to be, and that we want to adjust it. You know, similarly, I know I keep harping on this, but we do need to think about how much of that 1.5 billion plus do we want to program. And I'll just give you my bias. I think that the traditional method of awarding grants is doing a pretty good job, and that what we ought to be doing is trying to identify areas that are underrepresented, or where we think there's a target of opportunity that is new, or that for some reason is getting missed in the traditional grant making operation. But that's my own idiosyncratic view of what we should be doing. Other thoughts on this? Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to suggest that we proceed as follows, which is, first, if we're going to try to evaluate whether the balance of our funding is reasonable and that we're addressing needs in different parts of these sub areas appropriately, that we're going to have to learn and think a little bit about what are different ways of looking at the impact of disease and the technical methodology that's available to try to meet them. And so should we be doing some adjusting relative to where our current allocations are committed? And I think that will help us deal with what I think was an important question that Fred identified, which is that when you look at the impact of ALS, DALI doesn't really capture its general impact. And that needs to be part of how we think about allocating in some of these areas. So to me, we need to learn a little bit more to be able to really tackle these questions substantively, and to make some decisions as to what we recommend to the ICOC for allocation methods, pre-programming versus identification of unusual opportunities as two of the major approaches. Thoughts about this? Questions? Seeing nothing from the group, this might be a good time to go to the phone lines. Scott.
Sure.
Please.
If there's no further discussion, then I will ask for public comment. And so for the individual who spoke earlier, if you press *9 again, I believe.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Is it appropriate for me to talk about a company that is working, that is in a phase 3 pivotal trial for ischemic stroke, a company called Aphesis, a company that I sent 2 comments to Lana Morales that she was going to forward to your group. I'd be interested to know if you've received it and if you've had a chance to read it. But again, I go back to my first question. Is it appropriate at this time to talk about this? I would like to talk about it, but I don't want to step on anybody's toes. Shall I continue on?
Sir, you would be welcome to use 3 minutes to address an area
Let
of
me continue on. Yes, I'm reading from the first comment that hopefully you've all received. Yesterday, I sent a second comment. It's a PDF file, an overview, a presentation from Athersys. It goes into detail, some of the neuro diseases they're working on, trauma, but I'm primarily interested in ischemic stroke. Again, my name is John Ridelli. I live in Huntington Beach. I'm a shareholder in Athersys. I'm writing to you or speaking to you now in support of consideration by CERN for help in funding of Athersys Masters 2 pivotal phase 3 clinical trial for acute ischemic stroke patients. For your information, Masters 2 clinical trial is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial designed to enroll 300 patients in the United States, including Palo Alto and Sacramento, California. The study is evaluating the efficacy, and safety of multi-stem allogeneic cell therapy via IV infusion in patients who have suffered moderate to moderate severe ischemic stroke. The Masters 2 study has received several regulatory designations and regulatory agreements, including Special Protocol Assessment, or SPA, Fast Track Designation, Regenerative Medicine, Advanced Therapy, or REMAT. I've been invested in company with Athersys. One great thing about Athersys, they have a great relationship with the FDA. As you well know, stroke is 17 million people suffer a stroke every year, and it's the leading cause of long-term disability. Athersys is developing multi-stem cell therapy for the treatment of stroke, which may be delivered up to 36 hours after the stroke. This dramatically opens up the time window for allowing 90 to 95% of stroke patients to be eligible to receive the therapy. I'm reading from what Dr. Robert Mays, Executive Vice President of Athersys. Meaningful long-term improvements in patients' recovery are the cornerstone of our hypothesis about how multi-stem cells may provide benefit. It is what we have observed in multiple preclinical animal models of neurological injury, and it is why we have built a 365-day endpoint into the Masters 2. However, when limited to a 90-day evaluation window, the full potential of multi-stem cell therapy is not likely realized. So
Excuse me.
listen to this.
Pardon me. I'm sorry. I just want to let you know your time is up. If you could wrap up your comment.
Anyway, I hope you have the time. You know, what good is sending comments if they're not read? And I know how busy we all are. I just hope that you have a chance to review the public comments that I sent. And that's all I can ask. And I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, sir. I'll just respond briefly by saying that we have clinical trial grant opportunities at CERM. Athersys should apply for one of those grants, and it will be judged on a competitive basis with other clinical trial grants, but it may well be successful. So they should apply for a grant. With that, we're 2 minutes over time. So let me thank you all for lively and interesting discussion, and I will see you at the next meeting.